Donald Trump is quite popular in many countries around the world with publics, in part because a lot of people may have seen Joe Biden as a continuation of the establishment of the past. And for a lot of developing countries, that system really was not beneficial to them. So Trump comes in and says, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to break things and then reestablish different patterns, even if it benefits America at the expense of these countries. There's something very appealing about the Trump message. What do you take away from these types of survey results that are indicating some degree of popularity for Donald Trump?
For decades, Latin America was just not in the eye of Washington. It was the Middle East, the war on terror, it was the rise of China, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Latin America was just sort of the 80s thing, the El Salvador, Nicaragua, Somoza, Sandinistas. That era was seen as gone. With Donald Trump, Latin America becomes much more important in the U.S. prism, driven in many ways by domestic concerns, but also driven by the fact, as Cobus, you said previously, that no other power should really enter and create significant, substantial spaces in this continent of the Americas, which is an American space. This is where America lives.
In putting in basic infrastructure, basic services in parts of Africa where they are not available, you can A, make a lot of money, and B, get a lot of political capital. And that was implicitly what the Biden administration was aiming for in something like the Lobito Corridor, and adding like agriculture and communications and stuff on top of the Lobito Corridor, as on top of essentially an extractive kind of minerals focused project. So, now those optics are not Republican optics, and a lot of that kind of sweeteners on the African side fall away. China knows what those are worth, and they are very set up to make money from them. So it's win-win for them. So I think in that sense, I think the Trump administration is just going to create a lot of opportunities for China, a bunch of new opportunities, I think, for China, and reinforcing old opportunities for China.
I think Trump 2.0 has the space, the room, given that he won the popular vote, this time unquestionably won it, and he also has Congress on his side for the first 2 years at least. So he's got the space to come in and put his personal stamp on it, whatever that is. And if it's going to be leaning to his instinctive statements on China, then I think we may see phases of this. First phase, perhaps a more aggressive one, followed by some deal making.
And how many nations are in ASEAN, by the way?
I couldn't tell you the exact amount of nations in that,
but
I know we have allies in South Korea and Japan and in AUKUS with Australia, trying to work on submarines with them.
Mr. Hegseth, none of those countries are in ASEAN.
Across.
None of those three countries that you've mentioned are in ASEAN. I suggest you do a little homework before you prepare for these types of negotiations.
The person who's going to run the most powerful military in the world, not knowing where Southeast Asia is or what Southeast Asia constitutes in terms of ASEAN.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by our subscribers and Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join a global community of readers for daily news and exclusive analysis about Chinese engagement in Asia, Africa, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to talk about Donald Trump and the new incoming administration in the United States. Next week at this time, Donald Trump will be back in the Oval Office for his second round as president of the United States. Now, in the United States, this is causing quite a bit of anxiety for about half of the population. Also, for a number of American allies around the world, there are a lot of concerns. But a new European Council on Foreign Relations poll that was released this week indicates that not everybody around the world is very concerned about Donald Trump's return to the White House. In fact, a lot of people are very excited about it. And what we're going to talk about today in the show is how does Donald Trump's return impact the Global South, and then also China's maneuverability in the Global South, and then perceptions from the Global South about U.S. power as it's coming. So let's talk about some of these results from the ECFR poll. Now, let me give you a few data points on the background of this poll so you have a little bit of context, Cobus. This was done back in November of last year. They polled people in 16 European countries. Altogether, 24 countries were surveyed, 28,549 people. Now, one little side note is that in China, they only surveyed people in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Beijing. So keep that in mind when you hear the China figures, that's kind of a bogus number because it's as if we did a poll of the United States and we only surveyed people in New York, LA, Chicago, and Seattle. That would give you a highly distorted view of the United States. Just the same, when you survey people in those 4 big cities in China, you are not getting an accurate view of China. And I suspect that when we look at the methodology in the ECFR poll, it does break down a little bit because a lot of the surveys that they did were by internet, and that too biases towards urban elites. It biases towards people of a predilection for these kinds of things. Rural communities, people not connected to the internet are not represented in that. So take this with what it is. So the main question that ECFR asked was, do you think the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president is a good or bad thing for your country? And Cobus, 84% of people in India said yes, it is a good thing. Saudi Arabia, 61% said a good thing. Russia, surprisingly, 49%. China, 46%. Again, I think there should be an asterisk next to that China number because I suspect that if you were looking out into the countryside in China and out of those major cities, views may not be quite so optimistic. Your country, South Africa, and I'd be interested in your take on this, 36% of the people say that Donald Trump as U.S. president is a good thing. The numbers start getting decidedly lower as we become closer to U.S. allies. So the European Union, 11 countries in the EU, 22% said it's a good thing. The UK, only 15%, and South Korea, Cobus, only 11%. So very, very low. Lots of skepticism in South Korea. Let me just read you one more data point from this, and then I'd love to get your reaction. Do you think the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president is a good or bad thing for peace in the world? So talking about the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and elsewhere. In India, 82% people think that it's good for peace. Saudi Arabia, 57%. China, 52%. Russia, 45%. And in your country, 42%. Let's go down to the bottom of the poll. Once again, lots of U.S. allies there. The European Union, only 29% think that Trump is going to be good for peace. The UK, just 19%, and then South Korea, 17%. Cobus, do these numbers surprise you in any way?
They do and they don't. Like, they do in the sense that it does reflect the breadth of opinion about incoming President Trump. And I think to a certain extent shows that one of his political superpowers has been that he somehow presents himself as this kind of, or he functions as a kind of a screen that everyone can project different things on. You know, so he has had so many opinions, he has kind of like espoused so many viewpoints that there's something to find there for many people. So I think in that sense, it's interesting to see it in action. It is striking, as you said, that the closest allies tend to be the gloomiest about his election. I guess for the people for the countries who've been more distant from the US, for them, he may bring a change in the patterns, particularly, kind of considering that the Biden administration was very strong on identifying allies and consolidating them and identifying opponents and excluding them. And while I think those who were traditionally closer to the US may see the terms of that cooperation in danger. So I guess that's what we're seeing in Europe. I think that's also kind of what we're seeing in South Africa. Because, South Africa, despite the optics of the relationship, has had a very kind of, in many ways, a very warm cooperative relationship with the United States. And I think many South Africans are now worried that that's in danger.
Well, let's get a perspective on this from somebody who follows these issues of great power competition, public opinion, and all of this from a Global South perspective. And one of the rare people to do this all from Washington, D.C. Sarang Shidore is the director of the Global South program at the Quincy Institute, which is a nonpartisan institute, a truly nonpartisan institute. A lot of institutes will say, and think tanks will say they're nonpartisan. These guys get half their money from the Koch brothers and half their money came from George Soros. I mean, try to match that in terms of nonpartisanship. So, Sarang, a very good morning to you, and it's wonderful to finally have you on the program.
It's wonderful to be here, Eric, and be actually a core part of all the good work that you and Cobus have been doing over the years on connecting the themes that you connect. Just to preface what we're going to say, we started with seed contributions from Soros and Koch in equal parts, but over time, we have grown well beyond those, and we draw from number of donors that you can see from our website. It's all transparent, and we remain transpartisan. Absolutely, you're right. And that's something we actually cherish and pride ourselves on, because we do think that there are solutions. They're not Democratic or Republican solutions, but there are solutions for the American people. And that should transcend parties and, in fact, go well beyond. That's why we say transpartisan.
I like that, transpartisan. And boy, you guys have a very unique way of making a lot of people very unhappy in Washington, D.C., which I say that and bestow upon you as a major compliment. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Let's start with this ECFR poll. Some of the numbers, again, we talked about in the Global South, a lot of countries seem to be, if we trust these polling numbers, but some of it makes sense from our own anecdotal experience that Donald Trump is quite popular in many countries around the world with publics, in part because a lot of people may have seen Joe Biden as a continuation of the establishment of the past. And for a lot of developing countries, that system really was not beneficial to them. So Trump comes in and says, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to break things and then reestablish different patterns, even if it benefits America at the expense of these countries. There's something very appealing about the Trump message. What do you take away from these types of survey results that are indicating some degree of popularity for Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think, Eric, you got that right. I agree with you that the current system, the international order that is led by the United States even now in many ways, is just not meeting the expectations. And those expectations are rising with every passing year of leaders and the people of the Global South. They're impatient. They're seeing many double standards. They're not seeing necessarily their rise facilitated by current structures. If anything, there are barriers to them increasingly coming from Washington, of both establishment figures from both parties. And there is an impatience and exasperation. And that's why you see these turn to alternative fora such as BRICS. It's not that they're anti-Western. What they're trying to see is if there are complementary approaches that can plug all the gaps that are emerging in the current governance or the way the international order is set up. So with Trump, there comes peril, of course, because he's a unilateralist in many ways, but also comes promise because the old order wasn't working, and maybe there are opportunities that can be seized if one is nimble enough as we go through the transition. And so those states that are sort of out of the core see opportunities. Those states that have been inside the core of the U.S. traditional system see mostly peril.
Yeah, that I also definitely, kind of see that. Just as an opener, like, how are you personally kind of going into the new Trump era? Like, kind of, what are some of the conversations you're having and also that you're hearing in Washington, around what the new era will be like?
So I think there are a lot of concerns clearly, and I didn't start with the concerns because I think that's sort of much discussed. In Washington, we live in a kind of a bubble here. It's inside the Beltway, and it's dominated by establishment-oriented discourse. But certainly, I think from the U.S. Global South relations perspective, the biggest concerns are coming from those who work on the Americas, because the Latin Americanists are seeing some of these older patterns reemerge with Donald Trump's, attempt, or let's say his statement on the Panama Canal that he would like it back. Of course, Greenland is a much more European question, but the issues with Mexico, immigration, USMCA, the trade agreement with Canada, the potential of Mexico and Canada being differentiated in the way the United States looks at trade, or at least disaggregated, are all those that Latin Americanists and those who are from that region are very concerned with. On the other hand, there are also conversations that you will pick up on the side, and I think those are going to grow with time, of opportunity, of possibilities of reestablishing new sorts of patterns that may benefit the United States and may actually create a different kind of a world that if things go, in a sort of organic manner, then perhaps will create a sort of a rough balance that at least benefits some countries in the global south.
I think you're right that Latin America is going to be the major foreign policy focus for the Trump administration, in part because Senator Marco Rubio from Florida is his nominee for Secretary of State. And of course, he's from a district and a state that is very focused on the Americas. He has a Cuban connection. And don't forget that the Panama Canal threat that Trump raised had a strong China component to it. And so Latin America intersects with the fears about Chinese encroachment into the Western Hemisphere that makes a lot of Republicans very anxious. Let's talk about China and what does this present for China? So in one sense, the Chinese are presenting themselves as the more stable, more consistent, more reliable major partner. That is the message that we're getting out here in Asia. They see the Trump administration as very turbulent. At the same time, there is a scenario that exists out there that U.S.-China relations may actually stabilize under Trump. We've already seen Trump express some openness to making a deal on TikTok. Trump has said that he has no plans to protect Taiwan. He's been very outspoken about Taiwan, saying that they stole the chip technology from the United States and that they have to pay more for their defense. He's even sent signals that the Philippines may not be his top priority either. All of these are things that the Chinese policymaking community loves to hear. So there is a scenario here where there is some stability in the U.S.-China relationship. There's another scenario, to be fair, that it becomes far more contemptuous, far more confrontational. How do you see China in this new world that begins on Monday, on January 20th?
Right. So I think Trump has expressed all those sentiments that you just listed, no doubt. And many of them are breaks from the establishment tradition in Washington. But then if you look at his appointments to the National Security Council, whether it's Mike Waltz, or it's Alex Wong and others.
And Rubio, of course.
Rubio, of course, absolutely. They all carry with them a very hawkish approach, framework when it comes to China. In fact, there's also, of course, Elbridge Colby, who has argued in a rather widely read book here in Washington on bringing Taiwan into the U.S. security defense perimeter, so to speak. Yes, for policy, Undersecretary for Policy in the Pentagon.
And he's going to be an assistant defense secretary, if I'm correct, I think.
Yes, he is.
Right. And he's a very outspoken defender of U.S. protection of Taiwan.
The appointments don't match some of Trump's rhetoric. And this is, again, we have to go back to Trump 1.0 when we had Mike Pompeo there as well at the time, who made his famous statement on the Philippines and the South China Sea. But also we had the National Security Strategy of 2017 that identified China as a revisionist power and also Russia, and laid out the foundational elements of the great power competition frame that President Biden actually continued. He continued many of Trump's policies, and this was one of them. So the record is not that of necessarily creating a bridge. Now, again, the record also is of Trump going off and meeting the North Korean leader in Singapore and Vietnam. And that, again, you would not expect from an establishment policy. Now, nothing came of those meetings at the end of the day, but they were rather bold attempts to break through what was, increasingly contentious at the time. So we'll have to see how Donald Trump, whether his appointments are meant as an opening move to sort of lay the table in a way that pushes rivals such as China into a corner, and then the president comes in and kind of cuts the Gordian knot, if you will. Or is it sort of more of Trump 1.0 when we had the revival of the Quad, we had the statement on the Philippines, we had, even statements on Taiwan and other moves in Asia that were militarily more hawkish. I think Trump 2.0 has the space, the room, given that he won the popular vote, this time unquestionably won it, and he also has Congress on his side for the first 2 years at least. So he's got the space to come in and put his personal stamp on it, whatever that is. And if it's going to be leaning to his instinctive statements on China, then I think we may see phases of this. A first phase, perhaps a more aggressive one, followed by some deal making.
Okay, Cobus, let me put something to you. So Sarang has talked about how people like Eldridge Colby are going to be very focused on Taiwan. There is a large community in the DC policymaking space that focuses on the South China Sea and Asia. So that's going to get a lot of attention. We've talked about how Latin America, especially because Rubio himself has a Latin American power base, that will be a major focus. But Africa is going to be an interesting region. And I contend, and I'd like to get your take, that Trump is going to be good for China in Africa because at the end of the day, Trump is not really going to be that interested in Africa. He's not going to travel to Africa based on what we saw in the first administration. In fact, he'll probably implement visa restrictions and maybe even AGOA, and your ties with your country are going to strain even further. Maybe I can put the same question to you. How do you think China is going to fare in places like Africa in the next Trump administration?
I tend to think that China will do pretty well in Africa, as you do as well, for a bunch of different reasons. One is that, Africa, I think, is just in lots of ways kind of off the radar. Like, we experienced that ourselves a little bit when we were in Washington last year, that even under Biden, like, there wasn't that much interest in Africa. It wasn't a kind of a burning topic for people. And also, China has such high complementarity in terms of what it offers. So I was struck by, the comment a few weeks ago when Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about streamlining the government. And one of the things that she was saying is, kind of that they're not going to be supporting is, quote, toilets in Africa, which I can definitely see what she means. But it was an interesting framing for me because she's framing it from an aid perspective, right? Kind of, and that has always been Africa's kind of dominant kind of position in the way that the world is seen. It's like Africa is the place you send aid to. What I think what is implied in her comment is a reality that I think China has recognized more than the United States, is that in putting in basic infrastructure, basic services in parts of Africa where they are not available, you can A, make a lot of money, and B, get a lot of political capital, right? And that was implicitly what the Biden administration was aiming for in something like the Lobito Corridor, and adding like agriculture and communications and stuff on top of the Lobito Corridor, as on top of essentially an extractive kind of minerals focused project. So, now those optics are not Republican optics, and a lot of that kind of sweeteners on the African side fall away. China knows what those are worth, and they are very set up to make money from them. So it's win-win for them. So I think in that sense, I think the Trump administration is just going to create a lot of opportunities for China, like a bunch of new opportunities, I think, for China, and reinforcing old opportunities for China.
Well, Sarang, let me bring us back to Asia and just talk a little bit about ASEAN in specific. And I want to get your reaction to, and Cobus, I'd like to get your reaction to this as well, to an exchange that happened this week on Capitol Hill in the Senate Armed Services Committee, where Pete Hegseth, who is the nominee to become Defense Secretary, had an exchange with U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois about Southeast Asia. And let's take a listen, and I want to get both of your reaction.
Can you name the importance of at least one of the nations in the ASEAN, and what type of agreement we have with at least one of those nations? And how many nations are in ASEAN, by the way?
I couldn't tell you the exact amount of nations in that, but I know we have allies in South Korea and Japan and in AUKUS with Australia, trying to work on submarines with them.
Mr. Hegseth, none of those countries are in ASEAN. None of those three countries that you've mentioned are in ASEAN. I suggest you do a little homework before you prepare for these types of negotiations.
Gentlemen, this is an interesting exchange because we are on the cusp of the person who's going to run the most powerful military in the world, not knowing where Southeast Asia is or what Southeast Asia constitutes in terms of ASEAN. Again, not a very difficult question for someone tasked for this job. He clearly did not know it. Sarang, first I'd like to get your take, then Cobus, your take on what does it mean when we have somebody who is going to run a $1 trillion budget, 3 million strong army and $1 trillion budget, who has some basic geographic deficiencies in terms of his knowledge of the world. I don't say this to ridicule the situation. It's a serious question, but it should be concerning for maybe people here in Southeast Asia who are wondering where they fit in all of this. Sarang, what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I wasn't surprised actually because ASEAN, the way I think it was Tammy Duckworth was the senator, I believe,
Yes.
asked the question was framed around ASEAN. And ASEAN has always had a lower priority in Washington's framework. And of course, President Biden did appoint that envoy and so forth. But fundamentally, if you look at how IPEF was structured, it was structured based on a bilateral conversations, not with ASEAN.
Sure, but 700 million people live in this region. I mean, this is a very big part of the world.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I am a huge fan of ASEAN and a huge follow and write on it myself, of course. But the fact is that the framework that I think Washington is increasingly moving towards has been Southeast Asia rather than ASEAN in the Biden case. In the Trump case, it is going to be focused even more differentiated based on potentially if tariffs, and Trump has said many times that the word tariff is a beautiful word, as he once said. So if you look at just the trade imbalances that drives his tariff priorities, Vietnam really stands out as a country which is now running more than $100 billion in the U.S. is running a deficit with Vietnam. Whereas the Philippines, on the other end, has a very small trade surplus with the United States and is a very key geography when it comes to the strategic calculus on China, which again, if Colby and others have their say on this, will actually become quite important for Donald Trump's administration. So I think the picture in Southeast Asia may be further disaggregated than even where the Biden folks were actually doing without saying so, which is to break it sort of down into those states that are critical to sort of the nodes around China versus states that are less critical, and that then they emerge much more as economic questions. And here, the surplus countries such as Vietnam or possibly Thailand, and also questions around supply chains may also play a role. So whereas the region has been extremely mature and remarkable, actually, in terms of forging ASEAN, in terms of forging a space of integration, of trade, of the movement of people and goods and capital, and creating a dynamic region of the global south. The most dynamic, perhaps, in the entire global south is the ASEAN region. The Washington perspective with a security layer and then a trade layer below that tends to look at this from a much more disaggregated sense. And I think the Trump team will continue to do that. Now, the region may, of course, have other ideas because there is China as a partner. There are other states that they're building ties with increasingly in the Middle East and so forth. So what we may see is a sort of whereas Washington sort of separates Philippines out a little more in terms of security and then focuses perhaps a little more on Thailand or Vietnam or perhaps even Indonesia for trade deficits. The region may continue along trying to forge complementary structures that kind of, let's say, insure it against too much uncertainty on this front. Even as I think individual leaders like Prabowo in Indonesia and the Vietnamese leadership will look for deals, will try to find ways in which they can accommodate some of the administration's pain points and do carve-outs.
But you don't sound concerned that Hegseth didn't know any of the countries in ASEAN.
Well, I mean, it's very concerning for sure, but I guess perhaps I didn't expect him to know. I mean, in the hardcore,
the bar was pretty low, I guess, in that respect. I guess.
Yeah, in many ways, because here again, if we are talking with the Pentagon, if you go to these hardcore defense circles in the United States, they see China and then they see a system of alliances. And then they see the geography, and they don't really see an integrated space called ASEAN very much. The economics folks do more, but even there, as I said, the policy responses were much more bilateral.
Yeah, that's what Evan Feigenbaum, who's the vice president over at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he contends regularly that the United States has a problem where they see the rest of Asia through a China lens. And I bet you if we had Evan on the show, which is one of my long-term dreams to have him come on the program, he would probably tell us that he too wasn't surprised maybe that Hegseth did not know a Southeast Asian country. What was your reaction to that exchange?
My first reaction was, this is bad news for the Philippines. The fact that he couldn't even come up with the Philippines, considering how prominent they've been, in terms of framing themselves as like this important domino kind of that needs to be not knocked over. So that was interesting for me. It also reminded me of an interesting poll that came out of Merix, the German think tank that focuses a lot on China, where they were asking a lot of kind of experts on how they think China is going to respond to the Trump era, and by orders of magnitude more than the other answers, the main answer from them was China's going to lean into its relationships in the global south. And so it was interesting how kind of like Hegseth was asked about the global south and then responded with South Korea and Japan, which is, it was revealing, and Australia, So overall, it's an interesting kind of like data point for me, among others, because I kind of expected like South China Sea issues to play more prominently. It makes me wonder in the larger sense, Sarang, is, one of the hallmarks of the Biden era has been a very rapid kind of build up, or maybe specifically kind of like patching up and shoring up of alliances. How do you think the alliance building and maintenance issue is going to go under Trump?
Right. So I think there's no question that the way alliances are looked at is going to be different compared to the Biden administration. The biggest difference is going to be with the Europeans. And I don't write or analyze Europe really, but from what I can see from 30,000 feet, there's definitely a downgrading of Europe's centrality in the American gaze from the Trump people. The Biden team was, in many ways, you could argue, was almost Eurocentric in the sense that it placed NATO. I mean, Biden many times called NATO as sacred. Article 5 commitment is sacred. I don't think Donald Trump sees Article 5 as sacred. He's in a different place when it comes to the Europeans. In some ways, he treats Europeans as less privileged compared to other states in a strange, interesting way compared to Biden. In that sense, again, I think the Global South states see that as an opportunity as well, because whereas the Biden team was so much about NATO and Japan, the so-called Global West, if you will, was so centered on that. The Trump team is more, I wouldn't say exactly equal opportunity, but it's a little more leveled in that sense. So I think that's where the alliances question comes. But then the China question presents a different kind of a challenge. If Trump were a true isolationist, he would cut a deal with China on partitioning Asia, if you will, effectively, and go home, and then focus much more on the neighborhood and, priorities at home. But I don't think Trump is actually an isolationist. He's going to have a hybrid response to China, which is the potentials, as we said, of deal making, but also with his appointments and his history of the first term. There remains a very strong possibility that he would continue the Colby line on this, which is to continue to shore up alliances, deepen them militarily. I'm not saying IPEF and all is out of the window, of course, militarily, and which means that actually the Philippines may remain important to Trump, not quite in the Biden way, where climate change was talked about and, Luzon Economic Corridor was emphasized of late, although not much has happened on it yet. It may be a much more narrowly focused conversation on the strategic geography and on the military side of the equation with the Philippines. So Philippines is going to be an interesting case to watch because it's not in many ways a core state, a core ally historically in terms of the way the U.S. has seen it. Japan is much more important, South Korea too. So that's how I see it. In many ways, the Asian alliances will remain central if Trump's more hawkish instincts come to the fore, but narrower in the conversation. And European allies, it appears, from what I can see, is certainly going to be downgraded more, even as there will be an attempt on, I think, a peace deal on Ukraine.
What people in the MAGA national security community will say, people like Elbridge Colby, is that don't judge Trump based on what he says, judge him on what he does. And his actions on Taiwan and China were very different than his rhetoric on it. So I think that's a very important distinction that we have to make, and we have to really evaluate the Trump foreign policy on actions, not on the rhetoric, because the rhetoric will take us into 20 different directions, like Greenland and Panama Canal. And again, that's just rhetoric. We need to see what actually happens on the ground. But a lot of people out here in Asia are not going to sit around and just wait to find out. We have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity just in the past week by the Japanese in particular. The Japanese foreign minister was in Manila this week. Takeshi Iwaya was with his Filipino counterpart in Enrique Manolo. That follows a visit by the Japanese Prime Minister to Indonesia to meet with Prabowo Subianto. So the Japanese are moving very quickly. I think there is concern in Tokyo that they may not have 100% faith in the alliance that they have with the United States, and they want to make sure that in particular this...
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, Japan has also been very strongly reaching out to China. So what was interesting is that also this week there was a high-level meeting between the Liberal Democratic Party and the Komeito, their alliance partner, with the CPC. And there was like very high-flown kind of vows to improve, China-Japan relations and so on. So it's sorry to interrupt you. I think it's a really revealing kind of like move from Japan to be leaning into Indonesia and, kind of Southeast Asian allies, traditional allies like US allies, and then also with China.
Well, this comes on the heels of Cambodia upgrading its diplomatic ties with a number of countries. Vietnam has upgraded diplomatic ties to comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan, Australia, Korea, the United States a couple of years ago when Biden came. And so there is a sense here that the region is bolstering itself for a more turbulent period where the United States may not be as active, and they don't necessarily want to be fully exposed to China. So they're building friendships in lots of other places that didn't happen. Sarang, what's your take on all this movement that Cobus is talking about and what I just described with the Japanese?
Yeah, so even as many global South states sense opportunities with Trump, they're very aware of the concerns and risks. So one response to that is to create alternative complementary structures. Those structures can be BRICS, which is a much weaker institutionally much less institutionalized sort of a play. But then I think a stronger possibility is to create regional structures or bet much more on regional linkages. And this is where I think Asia is best equipped because it already has a thick web of institutional structures. It's essentially at peace outside of Myanmar. Southeast Asia and East Asia are at peace. It's a dynamic region. It's a high-tech region, including in Southeast Asia. There are all the pieces there for the region to create a kind of a quasi-autonomous space, which it already is really, but deepen that further, given the volatility and uncertainty emanating from Washington and also to some extent from Europe. And I think the Japanese, and if you recall when Trump withdrew from the TPP negotiations, the Japanese led the creation of the CPTPP as an alternative, even as ASEAN was leading RCEP negotiations for a while and successfully concluded it. So the region already has a history and a memory of doing these things in autonomous ways, and I think this can only deepen. And by the way, just on Japan, it's very interesting because when Ishiba became prime minister, and I know that his position is weaker now with the elections, but still he is prime minister. But his what was most cited in the U.S. media was his interest in an Asian NATO. And, when you think of Asian NATO, you immediately think of a kind of a Cold War type of a response to China. What was less covered is the fact that he did talk about Asian NATO, but much more in a regionalization sense. And also he talked of cooperation with China when it comes to dealing with things like natural disasters. So having that engagement, and he was not somebody who sort of was a zero-sum necessarily person on China. So the Japanese engaging with China, even as they are deepening their regional plays, makes perfect sense.
Sarang, one kind of interesting complication in Trump for me is that on the one hand he's very vocal about US national pride, kind of like he's always very, very kind of vocal about the US needs to be respected, for example, and shouldn't be laughed at, and even in relation to de-dollarization, for example, he was quite kind of strident about that. But at the same time, so far he hasn't been kind of as enthusiastic to be militarily involved, kind of in different kind of conflicts, or unlike many of his predecessors. So how do you think American firstism is actually going to play out? Like, there's so much kind of sound and fury from the Trump side about the uses of tariffs, for example, to shore up the US position. But do you foresee a kind of a Trump bestriding the earth, kind of slapping down people who don't respect the US as American firstism, or is American firstism going to manifest in other ways?
I think the biggest risk on America First, well, there's a domestic agenda there that we are not going to talk about here, but the biggest foreign policy risk when it comes to America First and is to repeat what I said earlier, it is the Americas. I think the America First perspective on the region, on the continent, is very much dominated by the Monroe Doctrine prism in terms of domination. And here, there are real possibilities of Donald Trump's plays in Latin America being seen very negatively, of course, by the left, which has always had a difficult relationship, or let's say a complex relationship with U.S. policy, but also maybe by the right. I mean, the extreme right, perhaps less, but even there could be certain responses if there are indeed interventions in the region for certain specific purposes. I don't anticipate that. I'm not predicting it. But there seems to be for decades, Latin America was just not in the eye of Washington. It was the Middle East, the war on terror. It was the rise of China, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Latin America was just sort of the 80s thing. You know, the El Salvador, Nicaragua, Somoza, Sandinistas. That era was seen as gone. With Donald Trump, Latin America becomes much more important in the U.S. prism, driven in many ways by domestic concerns, but also driven by the fact, as Cobus, you said previously, that no other power should really enter and create significant, substantial spaces in this continent of the Americas, which is an American space. This is where America lives. So some of us who have been calling for greater attention to Latin America would welcome increased focus on it, but it may be better for the focus to be focused on win-win deals and kind of finding common interests, which again, Trump has that side too. So we have to see, but the initial signs don't look very good for U.S.-Latin America relations.
No, and who's going to tell them that the Monroe Doctrine is no longer something that works? I mean, the majority of Central and South American countries have their largest trading relationship with China. And the BRI is very active in China. We just saw with the Chancay port in Peru. The United States doesn't have the mindset or the institutions right now set up to rival that in the Americas. So there's going to be a lot of huffing and puffing about the Americas. But at the end of the day, the facts on the ground as they are probably will not change all that much, in part because the Chinese want to move away from the U.S. as a food supplier. And where are they going to go? They're going to go to places like Argentina and Brazil, who are major food producers. So you can see under the Trump administration potentially a shift more towards Latin America by the Chinese. You know, Sarang, let me just close our conversation today. And it's been just a fascinating look around the world to kind of take advantage of your expertise as somebody who's been in Washington, who knows this space, but again, has, you know, a background and is firmly anchored in the Global South. If I was part of a delegation of Global South leaders coming to Washington and the Quincy Institute and said, you know, Sarang, tell me what do I need to know in order to thrive in this new era that's about to begin, what would you tell them?
I think the first thing is that Trump is going to run a very personalized administration. So he has clearly picked folks that are loyal to him. The Biden team had the focus as a National Security Council that will, I expect, remain important. The Pentagon obviously has enormous clout, but I also expect Trump to have much more of the personal style, including personal envoys and channels. So the more these delegations can understand the Trump White House through personal ties to him and channels, the more, perhaps, the more thick the conversation could be and the potentials for win-wins. I think the opportunity cannot be neglected. The opportunity should not be downplayed. The fact that there is going to be uncertainty, volatility, and a kind of a, I don't want to say equitable, but a less differentiated treatment of allies versus the rest means that Global South states actually can get into the room if they have a compelling proposition in terms of economics, in terms of commerce, in terms of creating win-wins for not just the United States, but also for President Trump himself. And they should focus in on those kinds of ways of thinking, of trying to create a better partnership with the U.S., just as the U.S., I think, has also to look at these states as more opportunities than anything else.
Sarang, that is fantastic advice. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate it. Sarang Shidore is the director of the Global South program at the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C., and somebody we're going to check in with quite a bit this year to get his take on how things are going with the new president and his team in Washington. Sarang, thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric and Cobus. It was such a pleasure to join you today.
Cobus, wonderful to have Sarang on. We've known him for quite some time. We've had a chance to speak with him at Quincy Institute in D.C., and somebody whose work that we follow very closely. I really, take to heart his advice at the end there about really understanding the royal court inside the White House and who the people are. Things are different, okay? And this speaks to a bigger problem about the United States in the Global South. We often talk about China literacy and the lack of understanding that a lot of countries have about China, especially the changes that China's gone through in the past 5 or 6 years economically, politically, and how in many places like in Africa, people's mindsets are still 10 years out of date, which is unfortunate, and that they haven't kept up with all the changes that have taken place in China. And this is not a problem unique to Africa. We see it also in the Americas and in many other parts of the world. I would make the argument that there's the same exact problem about the United States. And I will say we, because I am an American, we are not the same people that we were 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I find that in my discussions here in Southeast Asia, and I've recently traveled to Cambodia, to Thailand, to Singapore, Vietnam, all these different countries. And when I have my conversations with scholars and stakeholders and politicians and diplomats, I find that they are disconnected from the real United States and the changes that have happened, that they don't fundamentally understand the forces that brought Trump to power. That is a huge problem, that they have got to get their U.S. literacy up. And that means don't only read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York media. You have to go beyond. It's what we were talking about, that if you're getting poll data just from New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami, and Seattle, you're missing a big part of the country. And you're missing the red states and how they see the world. This is a very complex country. It's a very complex actor. Many people have a false sense of security that they understand the United States because they watch American media and they watch Netflix and they watch a lot of TikToks. They think they know us through that pop culture. That's misleading. That's delusional. And I would argue that it really takes as much effort as we put into understanding China to understanding the U.S. and re-familiarizing yourself with the United States and who we are, because we've changed a lot. That would be my big advice to people trying to understand Trump 2.0.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's true in general. The US has changed a lot, since the global economic crisis, for example, right? So those changes those long-term changes are really important. But I think the US has also changed more recently. And I think some of the really big changes, there's some really, really big changes coming, I think. So just for listeners' time understanding, we're recording this on the day of Senator Marco Rubio's, inauguration hearings. So I haven't looked at what his actual kind of like comments were, but the leaked version that came before predicted that he was going to kind of explicitly not frame himself, his own work, as part of the liberal international order, but as part of a new form of like America First style foreign policy. We don't know what that means, but it's a huge shift. It's a really big shift. And I think one of the reasons why I think the Gaza conflict took on such a huge importance in the Global South is because it was happening right next to the Ukraine crisis. So one could see the difference in language being used in relation to, say, kind of countries, kind of getting involved in neighboring countries and in the process kind of damaging the liberal international order. One could see the difference in language being used in relation to Israel and in relation to Russia. It was a one-to-one comparison. And I think one of the things that Gaza has shown is that we're not in Kansas anymore. Not the US itself, but the West, the wider West, seems openly willing to use this kind of really extreme violence as part of kind of bigger, kind of security concerns or security priorities. So we're in a post-liberal order moment, and there's no going back to it. And so whatever kind of living with Western power is gonna take some different kind of like strategies, I think, for the Global South, and that fundamentally shifts China's role in everything. right? So it really is like the point that you were making about how the US has changed is really true. It was true in the big sense, but it's true in the very immediate sense as well. And in a lot of ways, I kind of don't know where we are. Like kind of like this, we're in uncharted waters. Similar to the climate crisis, we're off the map now. We're heading somewhere else now, and that I think is really important to kind of keep in mind. And that of course means that China, in lots of ways, becomes more predictable, more stable, easier to deal with, even though in many ways China scares people. So that's a very interesting paradox.
Yeah, when I heard the Rubio remarks, or the leaked remarks that he's going to give, again, we're recording this before his confirmation testimony, not his inauguration, his confirmation testimony. I thought, wow, that's probably going to puzzle people in Beijing and Moscow, because when he says he doesn't like the liberal international order, the folks in Beijing go, well, yeah, that's what we've been saying. That's why we wanted to set up all these parallel architecture and these other international institutions. Certainly, Russia hates the international order as it exists now, the rules-based international order. Oddly, it puts all three of these on the same side. None of them like the system the way it is right now. So we are in uncharted territory, and I suspect that all three of those powers, and one has to wonder where the Europeans fit in all of this, are going to try and reshape whatever era that we're going into. As you said, we don't know where we are right now, but we're going into something, and there's going to be a battle of ideas to shape who gets to come out on top of all of this. But I made an argument with you, and I don't know if this is overstating it or not, but I think that Monday, January 20th, is the end of what we traditionally called the liberal international order, the rules-based international order that started with the Bretton Woods institutions after World War II. We can bookend it, and we have a date when that ends, because I think on Tuesday, January 21st, as you've pointed out, we are in a new era. Whatever that is, I don't know, but with the United States no longer committing itself to be the guardian of these institutions the way it has since the end of World War II, where does that leave us? We don't know. I think this is a huge opportunity for China. I think it's going to make huge advances in its efforts to build institutions that are more aligned in its interests. And I think U.S. credibility may suffer tremendously in the years ahead with the countries in the global South. I'm not entirely sure that anybody in Washington cares that much, okay? They may not understand the impact of it in the short term, and there's not a lot of concern. So people like Pete Hegseth, who can't name a Southeast Asian country, I don't think he loses any sleep at night thinking if Vietnam is going to be more aligned with China than the United States. I don't know if he cares that much about that.
Yeah, in the short term, I can see them not caring. In the longer term, what that means is just a lot more. It's like a kind of a death by a thousand cuts, right? Kind of like none of it is huge, none of it is conclusive. It just becomes harder and harder to do business in the world. And of course, the US is essentially a large island and in many ways self-sufficient, so that might not trouble them as much. But it has very large implications for the way that the US is going to be a global power, I think, in the future. And that, I think, is going to be fascinating. It's going to be fascinating to see it change, and it's going to be fascinating to see the US population as a whole kind of react to it. Because, of course, obviously I'm looking from the outside, but from the outside, it does seem like the US still has a lot invested in the idea that it is number one. That investment is going to be harder and harder to sustain, I think, over time, simply because things are going to get very complicated.
And it's very important to Trump to be number one. It's very, very important for Trump to be number one, or that perception of being number one, or that perception of being the paramount hegemon in the world today. I just want to leave everybody with one final thought. And this is my theory, so I just made this up on my own. Take it for what you want. But I contend that Trump is only going to be president of the United States for 11 months and 1 week. And what that means is that 2025 that's the year he's going to get everything done that he can. As Sarang pointed out, he's got both houses of Congress. He's got this, what he feels is a mandate, even though he only won by 1.5% in the popular vote, but he feels that he's got a mandate, and he's going to push really hard. Come 2026, the attention's going to start shifting to the midterm elections. If history is a guide, then the House or the Senate or both will flip. And remember, the margins in both the House and Senate are still quite narrow. So the Democrats may have been beaten, but they're not down by any measure. There are still a lot of Americans who voted against Trump and support the Democrats. And if inflation goes up, And if there's a lot of turbulence, that could pave the way for the Democrats to take one or both houses of Congress. Then on the backside of the midterms in 2026 going into 27, we're on the downward slope into a very, very contentious presidential race that will have primaries from both the Democrats and the Republicans. Every single day that goes by, Trump's power drifts away and fades away a little bit more into lame duck status. So this is going to be the year in 2025 when he's going to get everything done. And that's why everybody's predicting, and he's told us this is going to be the case, Monday, January 20th is going to be just a lot of announcements, a lot of executive actions, a lot of new initiatives. Congress is fully behind him. So it's going to be a very tumultuous 2025. If I were the Chinese, Cobus, I would wait him out.
Yeah, strap in.
Time is on the Chinese side here. All they got to do is they got to try to run down the clock to 25 because they know that 26 is not that far away. Next year at this time, Trump is in a very different scenario as Congress and the political machine starts moving on from him and looks to the midterms. So if the Chinese, if they're smart, and I'm not sure they are, but if they are, they'll just try and run the clock down. Say, yes, Mr. Trump, we'll do a trade deal with you. Yes, Mr. Trump, we'll do all this stuff with you. We'll get back to you. We'll call you. I don't know if that's what they're going to do or not, but that's what the clock is not on Trump's side, by the way. So just something for them to think about. We are going to stick with this story quite a bit this year because it is going to shape so much of how China moves in the global south. In places like Africa, as Cobus talked about, I think there's going to be a lot of room to move. In Latin America, it's going to be very contentious. I think here in Southeast Asia, TBD, not entirely sure, because the Americans have a very big presence in this part of the world, militarily, economically, politically. The Chinese do as well. So we're going to look at each of the regions differently. It's going to be a fascinating year, an absolutely fascinating year. Cobus, I am actually quite excited about what's coming because for nerds like us who love to follow this, we couldn't have ordered up anything more interesting than what's going to happen in the year ahead. And so I'd love for all of you listening at home to join us in this journey and to support the work that Cobus and Shidore and Johnny and Edwin and Lucy are doing around the world in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to bring you fact-based, agenda-free, transpartisan, as we heard from the Quincy Institute, coverage of all these issues. And you don't get very much of that, especially around China. And if you'd like to join our community of readers, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or a teacher, we have a special half-off rate. Email me, Eric, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links. Subscriptions start at just $10 a month. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South project on Bluesky and X at China GS Project, or on YouTube at China Global South, and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.